October 1st, 331 BC. Dawn breaks over the plains of Gaugamela. A 25-year-old Macedonian king stares across the battlefield at 100,000 Persian warriors, the largest army ever assembled in human history. His advisors beg him to attack at night, to use darkness to neutralize the Persian numbers. Alexander refuses. "I will not steal victory like a thief." Then he does something that makes absolutely no sense. He goes to sleep. While his entire army panics about tomorrow's certain death, Alexander sleeps so deeply that his generals can't wake him the next morning. They literally have to shake him awake hours after dawn. When asked why he slept so peacefully before the most important battle of his life, Alexander smiled and said 5 words that explain everything. "Because now I know where Darius is." What happened in the next 90 minutes didn't just win a battle. It created a legend that would echo through 2,300 years. This wasn't warfare. This was a 25-year-old kid conducting a symphony of violence so perfect that military academies still study every move he made that day. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why Gaugamela made Alexander immortal. You'll see the moment-by-moment tactical breakdown of how 47,000 men destroyed 100,000. You'll discover the psychological warfare that broke an empire's will before the first sword was drawn. And you'll learn why this single battle changed the ancient world forever. But here's what nobody tells you about Gaugamela. Alexander didn't win through superior numbers or better equipment. He won because he turned the Persian Empire's greatest strength into a trap that destroyed them. And Darius walked right into it. To understand how one battle created a legend, you need to understand what Alexander was facing. Because the Persian force at Gaugamela wasn't just large. It was specifically designed to kill Macedonians. Darius III had spent 2 years preparing for this moment. 2 years studying Alexander's tactics. 2 years assembling the perfect army. 2 years choosing the perfect battlefield. This wasn't going to be like Issus, where a narrow coastal pass had neutralized Persian numbers. This time, Darius controlled everything. The battlefield itself was a weapon. Darius personally selected the plains near Gaugamela in modern-day Iraq, completely flat. No rivers, no forests, no terrain features that could disrupt cavalry charges. Then, he made it even better. His engineers spent months leveling the ground, removing rocks, filling holes, creating the smoothest possible surface for his scythed chariots and cavalry. The Persian army was a nightmare designed specifically for this moment. At the center, 10,000 immortals, the elite guard who had protected Persian kings for 200 years. On both flanks, 40,000 cavalry from every corner of the empire. Bactrian horse archers who could loose arrows at full gallop. Scythian warriors riding horses bred for endurance and speed. Armenian heavy cavalry in scale armor that reflected sunlight like mirrors. But the real terror weapons were the innovations Darius had prepared specifically for the Macedonian phalanx. 200 scythed chariots, each one equipped with 6-foot blades extending from the wheels and axles. These weren't just chariots. They were mobile killing machines designed to carve through dense infantry formations like a farmer's scythe through wheat. And 15 war elephants from India. Creatures the Greeks had never faced in battle, each one standing 10 feet tall, weighing 5 tons, capable of trampling dozens of men and terrifying horses just by their presence and smell. Darius had studied Alexander's victories at Granicus and Issus. He knew about the hammer and anvil strategy. He knew Alexander would try to pin the Persian center with his phalanx, while striking with his companion cavalry on the flanks. So Darius designed counters for everything. The scythed chariots would break up the phalanx before it could form a solid line. The war elephants would terrify the Macedonian horses and prevent cavalry charges. The massive Persian cavalry wings would encircle Alexander's smaller force and crush it from all sides. And if Alexander tried his usual tactic of charging toward the enemy commander, he would find himself surrounded by 10,000 immortals sworn to die protecting their king. Conservative estimates put the Persian force at 100,000 warriors. Some ancient sources claim 250,000. Modern historians settle on somewhere between, but the exact number doesn't matter. What matters is this: Alexander had 47,000 men. He was outnumbered at least 2 to 1, possibly 5 to 1, on a battlefield specifically designed to maximize Persian advantages. Any rational commander would have looked at these odds and negotiated, and Darius had offered exactly that. Before Gaugamela, the King of Kings sent messengers with an offer that would make most men rich beyond dreams, half the Persian Empire, Darius's daughter in marriage, 30,000 talents of gold, peace and partnership between Macedonia and Persia. Alexander's general Parmenion said, "If I were Alexander, I would accept." Alexander's response became legendary. "So would I if I were Parmenion." He rejected the offer. He chose battle. And that decision, that absolute conviction that he could win the impossible, is the first key to understanding why Gaugamela made him a legend. The night before the battle reveals Alexander's psychological genius. While the Persians beat drums and chanted war songs, trying to intimidate the Macedonians with noise and spectacle, Alexander's camp was silent. His men had been ordered to rest, to conserve energy, to sleep if possible. The Macedonians could see the Persian campfires stretching to the horizon, could hear the thunder of 100,000 men preparing for war. Every logical instinct screamed that tomorrow they would die. But Alexander had spent years building trust with these men. They had followed him through 3 years of continuous campaigning. They had won impossible victories, and if Alexander said to sleep, they tried to sleep. Alexander himself gathered his senior commanders for final orders. Parmenion would command the left wing with Thessalian cavalry and allied Greek forces. Craterus would lead the phalanx in the center. Alexander would personally command the companion cavalry on the right wing, as always. The plan Alexander outlined was insane. He would march his right wing diagonally away from the Persian center, deliberately exposing his flank to enemy cavalry. This would create gaps in the Persian line as they adjusted to follow him. When the gap appeared, Alexander would charge directly at Darius with his companion cavalry, while the phalanx held the center and Parmenion held the left. Every general at that meeting understood the stakes. If the timing was wrong, by even seconds, the entire Macedonian army would be encircled and destroyed. If Parmenion's left wing broke before Alexander reached Darius, they would be surrounded and slaughtered. If the phalanx failed to hold the center, the Persian cavalry would pour through and massacre them from behind. But Alexander had done something revolutionary in his preparations. He created a second line of infantry behind the main phalanx, positioned to turn 180 degrees and form a new front if the Persians broke through or encircled the army. A defensive box that could fight in all directions. It had never been done before. After Gaugamela, it became standard military doctrine. As dawn broke on October the 1st, the two armies faced each other across a mile of empty plain. The visual contrast was staggering. The Persian army stretched across the horizon, a bronze ocean that seemed to have no end. Their armor caught the rising sun, creating a wall of reflected light. The sound was overwhelming. War drums, chanting, the jingling of 100,000 bridles and the thunder of hoofbeats as cavalry units moved into position. The Macedonian army looked tiny by comparison. 47,000 men in tight formation, silent except for the occasional trumpet signal. No drums, no chanting. Just the quiet discipline of men who had accepted that today they might die, but they would make that death count. Alexander rode down his battle line on Bucephalus, his black warhorse. He wore the same armor as his men, carried the same weapons. The only thing that marked him as king was a white plume on his helmet. He shouted to each unit as he passed, calling men by name, reminding them of past victories, promising them glory. They have numbers. We have skill. They have gold. We have brotherhood. They fight for a king who will run. You fight beside a king who will bleed with you, the men roared. Not chanting. One massive battle cry that said everything that needed saying. Darius, standing in his golden chariot a mile away, could see Alexander on that black horse, could see the white plume moving along the Macedonian line, and he made his first move. A psychological strike designed to break enemy morale before the battle even began. The scythed chariots rolled forward. 200 vehicles of death, each one pulled by 4 horses, each one bristling with 6-foot blades designed to turn men into meat. The ground shook as they accelerated to full speed. The sound was apocalyptic, a rumbling thunder that grew louder with each second. The Macedonian infantry could see death rolling toward them. These weren't arrows they could block with shields. These were blades that would carve through formations, dismember men, create corridors of blood and screaming. This is the moment that separates legend from history, because Alexander had prepared for exactly this. Trumpet signals rang out along the Macedonian line. The phalanx, that seemingly solid wall of men and 18-foot pikes, suddenly opened. Gaps appeared between units, corridors of empty space. The chariots rolled through the gaps, through empty air where men should have been. And as they passed, Macedonian light infantry, positioned specifically for this moment, emerged from between the phalanx units. Javelin throwers and archers who had trained for months to kill chariot drivers. They aimed not at the horses, not at the chariots themselves, but at the exposed drivers. Arrows and javelins flew. Drivers fell, pierced through face and throat. Horses, suddenly without guidance, veered and crashed. Some chariots overturned. Others kept going through empty space until they emerged behind the Macedonian line, where reserve troops killed the drivers and captured the horses. In 90 seconds, Darius's terror weapon had been neutralized. 200 scythe chariots, the innovations that were supposed to shred the Macedonian phalanx, had accomplished nothing except proving that Alexander had prepared for everything. But this was just the opening move. Now came the real battle. Darius ordered his cavalry wings to advance. On both flanks, 40,000 horsemen began moving forward. The plan was simple and brutal. Crush both Macedonian flanks simultaneously, encircle the center, destroy the army in a killing pocket. It had worked for Persian commanders for 200 years. It should work now. If you're fascinated by military tactics and want to see how legendary battles were actually won, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell. We break down history's greatest commanders and the strategies that change civilizations. You won't want to miss what happens next. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion watched 15,000 Persian cavalry bearing down on his position. He had 7,000 Thessalian cavalry and allied Greek forces. The mathematics were brutal. He was outnumbered more than 2 to 1 by some of the finest horsemen in the world. His orders from Alexander were simple. Hold. No matter what happens, no matter how many Persians attack, hold the line. Give Alexander time to work his magic on the right. Parmenion was 65 years old. He had fought under Alexander's father. He had won battles when Alexander was a child. He knew his assignment was a potential death sentence. But he also knew that if he held, if his wing could absorb the pressure and refuse to break, Alexander would win the battle. The Persian cavalry hit like a tsunami. The impact of thousands of horses and riders crashing into Macedonian lines created a sound like continuous thunder. Men died in the first seconds. The Thessalian cavalry, some of the finest horsemen in Greece, met the Persian charge, and the melee became general. This wasn't elegant warfare. This was murder at close range. Swords against swords, horses screaming and falling, men dying in the press of bodies where skill mattered less than strength and luck. Parmenion's line bent under the pressure. Then it buckled. Persian cavalry broke through in several places, racing toward the Macedonian camp to loot and create chaos. But the second line of infantry Alexander had positioned turned to face them. The breakthrough became a killing ground as Macedonian reserves surrounded and destroyed the Persian raiders. Meanwhile, on the right wing, Alexander was executing the move that would make him immortal. Instead of meeting the Persian left-wing cavalry in a direct clash, Alexander ordered his entire right wing to march diagonally to the right, away from the Persian center, not retreating, angling, creating distance and tension. From ground level, it looked like madness. Every step took the Macedonians further from support. Every yard created more space for Persian cavalry to exploit. The soldiers could see Bessus commanding the Persian left, ordering his cavalry to follow and extend their line. But Alexander kept marching, kept angling to the right, kept creating that tension in the Persian formation. Bessus saw what he thought was a gift from the gods. The fool Alexander was exposing his flank. The legendary commander was making a basic tactical error, pulling away from his center, creating an opportunity for encirclement. Bessus ordered his cavalry to pursue, to extend left and get behind Alexander, to cut him off from the rest of the Macedonian army and destroy him. and as the Persian left wing extended to follow Alexander's diagonal march, gaps appeared in their formation. Small at first, then larger as units spread out to maintain contact with their neighbors. Alexander had been counting seconds in his head, judging distances with eyes trained by 100 battles, calculating the exact moment when the Persian extension would create the gap he needed. The moment came. A 200-yard gap appeared between the Persian left-wing cavalry and their center infantry, just a temporary thing that would close in moments as units repositioned. But Alexander only needed moments. He wheeled Bucephalus to face the Persian center, raised his lance high so every companion could see it, and screamed the order that had won him an empire. "Wedge formation! Charge!" 2,000 companion cavalry transformed from column into wedge in seconds. A perfect triangle with Alexander at the point. Each man knew exactly where to be. They had practiced this formation 1,000 times, in sunlight and darkness, at walk and gallop, until it became muscle memory. The wedge charged. The sound of 2,000 horses accelerating from standstill to full gallop is something that doesn't exist in modern warfare. The ground doesn't just shake. It vibrates. The air pressure changes. Men feel it in their chests before they hear it with their ears. The Persian infantry in front of the gap saw them coming. Provincial levies from the outer empire. Brave men, but not elite warriors. They had maybe 30 seconds to prepare for impact. Some tried to form up with leveled spears. Others ran. Most just froze, paralyzed by the sight of a bronze avalanche aimed directly at their position. The wedge hit with the kinetic energy of a modern artillery strike. Alexander's lance, 12 feet of oak and steel, punched through the first Persian it touched with such force that the man literally exploded. The combined momentum of Alexander, his armor, his horse, and the full-speed charge created impact forces that human bodies couldn't withstand. The lance broke. Alexander drew his sword without breaking stride. Behind him, the companions carved through the Persian line like it was made of smoke, each rider armed with a lance for the initial impact, then switching to swords for close combat. The wedge formation meant that the point hit first with maximum force, then the following ranks widened the breach, splitting the Persian formation apart. The Persian defense collapsed in layers. First the provincial infantry, then the cavalry units that tried to stop the penetration. Then the officer corps, noblemen who thought their armor and courage would stop the Macedonian tide. They all died, not from superior equipment, from superior training, coordination, and the absolute conviction that they would win. But Alexander wasn't killing randomly. His eyes never left the prize. The golden chariot at the center of the Persian line. Darius. The Macedonian wedge drove 400 yards into the Persian formation in 15 minutes. They carved a corridor of death through the greatest army on earth. Men tried to close the gap behind them, to cut off the penetration. But Macedonian cavalry on the flanks of the wedge protected the shaft, killing anyone who got close. The immortals finally reacted. 10,000 elite warriors closing ranks around their king. These were the best of the best. Selected from childhood for size, strength, and skill. Veterans of 100 battles. Men who had sworn sacred oaths to die protecting the King of Kings. Alexander went through them like they were harvested wheat. This is where eyewitness accounts become almost mythological. Ptolemy, who was there and later wrote a history of Alexander's campaigns, described him fighting in what seemed like divine fury, not berserk, controlled, but unstoppable. Every sword stroke killed. Every movement was economical and lethal. Immortals who had trained their entire lives fell before a 25-year-old who seemed to predict their moves before they made them. A Persian champion, Ariobarzanes, charged Alexander personally. This was a hero of the empire, a man with dozens of single combat victories. He came at Alexander with a spear thrust aimed at the throat, a killing blow delivered with perfect technique. Alexander's response was almost casual. He swatted the spear aside with his shield, leaned into Bucephalus's motion to close distance, and drove his sword through Ariobarzanes' face before the Persian could recover. The entire exchange took 3 seconds. That's what made Alexander legendary. Most warriors react in combat. They defend, counter, survive. Alexander attacked, continuously, relentlessly, mechanically. Defense was just preparation for the next attack. The immortals, despite everything they were, despite their training and courage and sacred oaths, had never faced anything like this. The Macedonian wedge had shattered their formation, turned the battle into individual combats where Macedonian training dominated. One by one, the immortals fell, and as they fell, the psychological impact rippled through the Persian army. These were supposed to be invincible. If they could die, if Alexander could kill them like they were nothing, what hope did anyone else have? Darius saw it all from his golden chariot, saw his guard collapsing, saw Alexander, covered in blood that wasn't his own, smiling as he killed. Saw the Macedonian wedge now less than 100 yards away and closing fast. And for the second time in his life, facing Alexander, Darius felt pure terror. This wasn't just a battle anymore. This was a young god of war come to claim what fate had promised him, and Darius made the calculation that destroyed his empire forever. My life is worth more than this battle. He turned his golden chariot and ran, whipped his horses into a gallop, abandoned his army, his plan, his empire, everything except his life. The moment that chariot turned, the battle was over. The immortals saw their god-king fleeing and broke. Persian morale, which had held despite the wedge penetration, shattered completely. Because in the ancient world, if the divine king runs, the gods have already decided the outcome. Persian soldiers who had been fighting desperately moments before simply stopped and fled. Units that had been holding their positions melted away. The cohesion that Darius had spent 2 years building evaporated in seconds, but the battle wasn't quite over. While Alexander had destroyed the Persian center, Parmenian's left wing was in serious trouble. The Persian right wing had smashed into it with overwhelming force and was pushing the Macedonians back. Some Persian cavalry had broken completely through and were attacking the Macedonian camp. Parmenion sent urgent messages to Alexander. "Left wing collapsing, need immediate support, or we're destroyed." Alexander faced the choice that separates good commanders from legendary ones. Chase Darius and possibly end the war with one capture, or save his own army from potential disaster. He split the difference with typical genius. He sent a portion of his companions back to support Parmenion, while personally pursuing Darius with the rest. He knew that in ancient warfare, you don't win by killing every soldier. You win by destroying enemy morale, and enemy morale was already destroyed. The companions who rode back to help Parmenion hit the Persian cavalry from an unexpected angle, creating chaos. The second line of Macedonian infantry turned to face the Persian breakthrough at the camp, surrounding and destroying the raiders. And Parmenion's Thessalians, reinforced and inspired by the news that Darius had fled, pushed back. By noon, it was over. An army of 100,000 had been broken by 47,000. Persian casualties estimates range from 40,000 to 90,000 dead. Macedonian losses were fewer than 1,000 killed, and perhaps 5,000 wounded. But the numbers don't capture what had actually happened. Alexander hadn't just won a battle. He had created a legend that would echo through 2,300 years. The pursuit of Darius lasted 75 miles before darkness forced Alexander to stop. The King of Kings kept running, abandoning his second chariot, his royal armor, his cloak. Everything that marked him as divine royalty was cast aside in his desperate flight. Within weeks, Babylon opened its gates to Alexander without resistance. Susa surrendered. Persepolis fell. The Persian Empire, which had existed for 220 years and ruled from Egypt to India, simply ceased to exist as a political entity. But Gaugamela's real impact was psychological. Alexander had proven something that changed the ancient world's understanding of warfare. Superior tactics and discipline could beat superior numbers. Combined arms warfare, cavalry and infantry working in perfect coordination could defeat any army no matter how large. And leadership that inspired absolute conviction could create multiplication factors that pure mathematics couldn't explain. The battle made Alexander a legend because it was perfect. The diagonal march that baited the trap. The timing of the wedge charge at the exact moment the gap appeared. The trust that Parmenion would hold the left despite being outnumbered and overwhelmed. The second line that turned potential disaster into victory when Persians broke through to the camp. Every element worked in synchronization. One miscalculation would have meant annihilation. But Alexander calculated perfectly. Modern military academies still study Gaugamela as the ultimate example of combined arms warfare and psychological dominance. The tactics are obsolete. Nobody uses sarissa phalanxes or cavalry wedges anymore. But the principles are eternal. Fix the enemy with one force while striking with another. Create gaps in enemy formations through maneuver and psychology. Target enemy command and control to create cascading failure. Maintain reserves to counter unexpected breakthroughs. Most importantly, inspire your forces to believe victory is possible even when mathematics says otherwise. Alexander embodied all of this at Gaugamela. And that's why 2,300 years later, when people hear the name Alexander the Great, they don't think of the other battles. They think of Gaugamela, the battle where a 25-year-old king faced impossible odds on a battlefield specifically designed to kill him, and won so decisively that he destroyed an empire and created a legend that will never die. That's the power of perfect execution. That's why one battle can make you immortal. Because Gaugamela wasn't just a victory. It was proof that genius, courage, and conviction can overcome anything, even 100,000 warriors and the entire might of the Persian Empire.